Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica guest lecture by Professor Brandeis Marshall. I will begin by introducing our speaker. We'll close with a few resources that will help you get to know SICSS-Howard Mathematica if you are joining us for the first time. Dr. Marshall teaches, speaks, and writes about the impact of data practices on technology and society. Her work contributes to the data engineering, data science, and computer science education fields. Through DataedX group, she guides current tech workers in building their data ethics and equity skills. Dr. Marshall's first book, Data Conscience: Algorithmic Siege on Humanity, will be released in September 2022. It unearths the interlocking computational and civic implications of data on digital processes, structures, and institutions. Brandeis holds a Ph.D. and Master of Science in Computer Science from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of Rochester. Welcome, Professor Marshall. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I am ecstatic to be here, well, virtually, in order to talk a little bit about the book and hopefully to provide a little bit of thought pieces as you move through understanding how data systems, structures, and processes work in the digital landscape. So for today, what I'm going to be going over is one of the chapters in my book, which is titled Plainly Bias. And so as in the introduction, this is coming from Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity. And this book is really engrossing ourselves in how data algorithms and society are working together and feed off of each other. And what does that mean for us as people that are now trying to understand not only our physical existence, but also what happens in the digital sphere. So with that said, I wanted to provide a little bit of a landscape for the book before we jump into this particular chapter. So as a description, I like to say that this book is for the rebel tech person or persons. It's really for people who actually acknowledge and who are ready to address some of the limitations of software development, data practices as well. And these are individuals who, I'm assuming like you, who recognize that that text culture often moves, it often is in a move fast, break things mentality, but that is inherently very problematic, and want to pinpoint ways that discrimination actually exists in the digital space and are trying to find and construct ways in order to make changes. So with that introduction, hopefully you are chomping at the bit to learn a little bit more about what's in the book, but also understanding how bias fits into this landscape. So let me provide a little bit of what is happening in, I believe, the digital society right now. And I've broken this up into 3 separate parts inside of this text. The first part is transparency, and it's really trying to reveal some of the outcomes and impacts of data, code, algorithms, and systems by organizations, companies, and groups. Trying to make sure that there is a way in order to craft what is really happening. So this is really about how do we think through oppression in digital systems? How do we think through computational thinking in digital systems and everything in between? The second part of the textbook is really about accountability. And this is the meats and potatoes of what's happening in the data lifecycle. So I kind of march through what is happening when it comes to collection and storage, analysis and visualization within the data space. So I want companies and people, in order to be more accountable, and what does accountability actually look like, So how do we hold organizations responsible for the consequences of their failures in AI systems and in other types of processes? So with these two first parts, it kind of leads directly into the third part, which is again, more about trying to kind of operationalize this transparency and accountability, but I put it under the umbrella of governance. And there's different definitions of governance. Sometimes it's just called bureaucracy, but I really redefine it as administration of equity and decency in our systems, processes, and of course, institutions. And I try to do my best in order to explain what is some paths that we can take as individuals, as people who code, if you do happen to code, as well as if you happen to be on the policy side, what type of things I think could be open for conversation and open for debate and discussion about how to move forward, and to do that as a collective and not make this a one trick pony or one broad stroke. So with this background of what the book is, let me share exactly what part I'm focused in on today, and bias fits directly in the transparency component, really trying to understand what are the outcomes and impact of what is happening in data. And please note, I do not talk about results because I feel like the word results is a pretty loaded word. I do talk about outcomes and observations and impact for that reason. Results make you think that it is a final conclusion, whereas outcomes is just telling you what is the output. So bias is one of these terms that has been co-opted by many different people within the tech space, both those who are with the analytical brain and those who are on the creative and communication side, who now are looking at bias inside of digital systems and trying to understand how do we get here, but then how do we get out of some of the biases. Now, I happen to get frustrated. And so as part of my frustration, I tweet. So I wanted to share one of my tweets that was pretty frustrating when I was looking up a lot of conversation about bias, and I was reading a lot of papers about bias, algorithmic bias, statistical bias, discrimination and prejudice, and everything else. And one of the challenges that I came across is that everybody wants to talk about bias in one particular vein. They want to talk about it as statistical bias, as errors. They don't necessarily want to talk about social injustice, even though they might be really talking and meaning to be addressing social injustice. They're only talking about what's happening in the code. And so, yes, this was my tweet. I was very tired of reading a lot of papers from the STEM disciplines that were just talking about defining bias as something that was fixable. So I want to dive into this a little bit. And of course, I'm going to start with definitions. So the very first definition when it comes to bias happens to be what I like to call the noun of statistical errors and systematic errors. And this is very much grounded in mathematical formulation, right? What happens if you have the decimal point in the wrong place? What happens if you wind up using the wrong equation? And then, of course, implementing that wrong equation happens if you're interpreting the results incorrectly because you've not provided the correct weights. This is being dubbed as one definition of bias. And so one of the ways in which I saw a lot of bias conversations is in the conversation around p-values. So if you happen to be on the statistical side of the data industry, p-values are controversial. Whether you use them or don't use them, there's this conversation of, is p-value actually a valuable measurement to understand statistical significance of a particular outcome, and then to what degree do you trust or the reliability of that p-value. What is your N? Is your N 30? Is your N 100? Is your N 1000? Is it a million? Can you trust the result? So that's the statistical error and systematic error that you can fudge in order to make it work. But the second definition is where I want to concentrate a lot more on, which happens to be the societal and the structural inequities that permeate our society. And this is very much grounded in what I like to call the presence and the dissemination of prejudice. And this happens to infiltrate our processes, our systems, and our institutions in the digital and in the physical world. So we've had many examples of these over recent years, but let me list a few just so we can have a point of anchor. So there's mortgage lending, there's standardized testing. Sometimes standardized tests don't test anything of particular value. Federal income tax and how income tax laws can be prejudicial to certain demographics based upon zip code. There's urban development, and there's many more cases and examples that I will not spend all of our time talking through. But this is one area that's also been dubbed bias. But what has happened, at least within the STEM disciplines, and particularly within the data and computing arena, now pretty much dubbed AI, is that there is a brick wall that goes between these two. There's some people that believe that definition 1 is what we should be talking about when we say bias. There are people who are on the other side of that wall who say we should only be talking about definition 2. And both parties don't necessarily talk well with each other. Unfortunately for me, I do see there are some statistical errors. So there is some issues with code that can be quote unquote fixed. And there are issues with code that cannot be fixed because of definition 2's determination of bias. So as a way in order to retool all of this, I did my own investigative work. And I found this, unfortunately, it was just a blog from 2020 that talked about the stages of bias for what they called ethical AI. And this is the figure that was in this particular blog. Very good idea to read this blog, by the way. But they go through, here is the 4 stages, and it starts with real world bias. And that's reflected in what they call data bias. And data bias is exposed by algorithmic bias. Then algorithmic bias is acted upon through business bias. And then, of course, business bias impacts what happens in the real world. Now, each of these terms have a certain definition within this blog. So real world bias is essentially our human bias, how we interpret the world, what happens to be the stereotypes that we kind of project out into society. And then data bias is of course, what happens when we take our stereotypes and we embed them into how we collect, how we store, and how we manage data. So for instance, if you can think of gender identities, most people who collect any type of survey information will say gender identities is male, female, and recently there's been a couple more surveys that actually say non-binary, but none go into many different other type of gender identities. So we've taken our real world bias, our human bias, and we've now embedded it into the data bias and how we collect and manage data. And then we take our interpretation of the data and then we stick it through algorithms that then of course have their own engine of discrimination and oppression. And the output of that algorithmic situation then leads to certain business understandings that will lead to hopefully some business ROI that then impacts what happens to the world and how the world engages with that data. So we've seen countless times how someone can grab information and then retool it in a way that when it comes out, the information that we think we're learning isn't accurate. Let me give an example. How many times have you seen a CNN poll that tells you what most Americans believe about a certain topic? A lot, a lot of polls that we've seen. And I know that I've never been called as a pollster. I know that I don't fill out CNN polls in particular. And of course, if you do happen to take a poll, you can fill out the poll multiple times. So you can answer it many different ways and you're the same person. So it's not very accurate. But that is shaping what happens to be narrative that is spoken about in media, right? So there's this stages system, right? A real world bias or human bias going into the data bias, then gets transferred into algorithmic bias and then leads to business bias that then again reinforces certain prejudices and certain oppression and certain bad things that people think about each other. And then this cycle continues over and over and over again. This was a good foundation, but I didn't believe there were stages. In fact, what I want to propose and what I did propose in the book is that we have what's called a bias wheel. And it literally is a wheel, like a car wheel. And in that wheel, of course, we have the wheel itself that will be rotating around. That's what the arrows are doing. They're rotating forward in this case. And then there's also the pressure points of what's happening with the spokes, and then what is happening in the middle or the hubcap, and how there is a transference of impact that happens between every point of the spoke. Now, as you can see in this image, there is a number at the end of each of the spokes. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And you're probably like, well, what's 1, what's 2, what's 3, and what's 4? And that's what I really do propose here, is how do we order these different biases in a way that we know how one feeds into the other, and then what is the reverberating impact from one bias to the other. So what I see is that we have this human bias, we have data bias, we have algorithmic bias, we have business bias, and they could be in any one of these 4 positions. Data bias could, of course, lead to algorithmic bias, that leads to business bias, that then leads to human bias, and any of the other orderings that are possible. And as you turn the wheel, there is always going to be an impact from one set of bias to the others. And this is the reason why within each spoke, I actually have this bidirectional arrow, is because there is this reinforcement. Once you have a human bias, that will impact every other bias, right? Every time you have a data bias, it will impact every other bias as well. If you happen to interpret data incorrectly coming into being ingested into a system, then that is going to impact with algorithms that you use, what type of metrics you're going to use, what type of interpretation you're going to have, and then what type of outcomes and recommendations and suggestions that you're going to make. And that's all informed by what happens to be your particular life experience, as well as what you've been formally taught. And that construct happens to sit very well within your human bias. So how do we navigate this space? I don't have answers. I'm just opening up it for questions and conversation here. But what we don't talk about in the transparency of our digital systems is that bias has these reverberating and cascading impacts. We want to just make it a zero-sum game. It's either statistical error or it's oppression, but it can be both. And it can show up in different ways for different demographics. And that's the type of mind opening that needs to happen so that when we are looking within digital systems, we are handling data, we are managing that data, we are deciding on what algorithms to use, we can be better stewards of how we are interpreting the results. Because those results, remember, are just outcomes. They're just observations. It's up to us as people in order to cast them in the proper light in which they should be cast and then acted upon. We can't mindlessly just take the data, manipulate it, put into algorithms that are manipulated, produce some type of interpretation, and then just let the algorithm and that interpretation rule the day without humans in the loop. So that's what I'm proposing. That's the conversation that I want to bring up, I want to have had, and for there to be much more of a thoughtful process in how we navigate this world of a bias, and how we really see how this bias works not only in our digital space, but how it impacts our physical world and what we need to do as humans in order to be better at discerning when the algorithm could get it wrong and the outcomes of the algorithms are not helpful. We need to be much more discriminating about that, in my humble opinion. So just to wrap up, the conversation that I'm having here about bias is really centered on transparency of our digital systems. And that transparency is not just of how the digital systems work, but how do we work inside those digital systems? What do we suppose and suggest that impact how we understand the digital systems? But then I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions, because I love leaving with questions to open it up for conversation. Is how do we define bias, oppression, and inequity? How are oppressions and inequities fused in digital systems? And then lastly, what's an organization's role in mitigating oppressions and inequities when it comes to any type of algorithmic processes, systems, structures, and institutions? So yes, this is a lot of questions. Yes, there's no straight answer. Yes, it's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the discipline. It's going to depend on a number of different factors in order to understand how we are going to navigate space. Because bias is going to be with us forever, because it's been with us forever. But now we need to start to really think through in the digital realm, how do we curtail ourselves from just running with whatever the algorithm said, assuming the data is always correct and accurate? How do we rear back our tendencies to let the system do it and now start asking some hard questions, start now putting in some roadblocks? Okay, because if we don't have put in these guardrails and these roadblocks, we're going to be completely driven by algorithms that have no way of understanding the context of the bias or understanding the disparate impacts of the biases that that are affecting our communities. All right, so with that said, I definitely want to thank you for your time and attention. Can't wait to hop in to the conversation, and filter some questions and think through and brainstorm some solutions. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us, Professor Marshall. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A and office hours with you during the Institute in June. Can you tell us how to get in touch with you?
Oh, sure. Let me just hop to that slide. You can contact me at Brandeis@DataedX.com. Of course, you can reach me via the website. And then, of course, I am on the Bird app as well as LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me in either place.
And what's the conference coming up that you're working on?
Oh, yes. The conference coming up is Black Women in Data Summit. It is for grown Black women who have been reorged a couple of times and want to get some little professional development and some networking and just to be around a whole lot of Black women in the data industry. So come commune, buy a ticket, gift a ticket, sponsor. Yeah, just contact me. I can put you in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.